qui al Festival Internazionale dell'Economia, ha già avuto modo di esporre
several times. He has already presented some themes and topics that he's going to deepen for us today. And for sure, with him, we're going to talk about international migration, about the causes and the effects, about the integration of immigrants, and immigration as an important hot topic. So these are some of the impellent topics, and I believe that it is going to be very, very interesting to listen to Professor Hatton's analysis of the situation and, if possible, recipe for solution. Europe, for sure, does need a European immigration policy. One of the main criticisms towards Europe actually focuses on the immigration issue. And in Trento, throughout these days, we have analyzed this issue from different viewpoints. Our Minister of Internal Affairs, Mr. Maroni, has spoken about this here in Trento, advocating for a strong European stance. Mr. Maroni claims Europe cannot leave Italy alone as far as this problem is concerned. And in a dialogue with Mrs. Bonino, this topic was addressed, and Mrs. Bonino gave two signs of alarms. Number one, there is no recipe for solution, so it is necessary to research, to think, to look for concrete solutions. And on the other hand, the need for approximately 2.5 million workers in our country in the next 10 years, another significant figure. But I do not want to steal too much time away from Professor Hatton's slot, and I would like to leave him the floor. And if necessary, I will try and further deepen Professor Hatton's presentation with possible questions at the end.
Let me first of all say how pleased I am to be here. It's wonderful to have an invitation to speak at the Trento Festival, and I'm extremely grateful to the organizers, particularly Tito Boeri and his team who've organized the program, and I think it's been a really fantastic festival, and I've enjoyed it very much. I also want to thank you, the audience, for coming, because I've seen how engaged the audiences have been in the events I've been to, and I really welcome you, and I'm very glad to see that you're here, especially when there's music and dancing outside in the streets, and it's a beautiful day. And so I'm all the more grateful for your attendance at this session. Let me apologize for speaking in English. If I were to try and speak in Italian, I think the talk would be extremely short, because I could say sort of more or less all the Italian I know in about, 30 seconds. I will try and speak slowly, though, for those of you who are receiving this through the translation. So if I don't speak slowly, please put your hand up and I'll try and slow down. Okay, the thing I want to talk about today is, as the title indicates, immigration policy with a particular focus on Europe. And let me give a little bit of background to that. I'm going to take an economic focus, which is not surprising, I'm an economist. There is a large literature that has been developed by economists, and much of it is focused on the causes of immigration from between countries, and also on the effects of immigration on the country to which immigrants go. And just recently, in the last, let's say, less than 10 years, there has been an increasing focus on immigration policy, not only from the point of view of what immigration policy does, or what it can and can't do, but also from the point of view of what immigration policy should be. And in order to think about that, we have to think about a number of questions, and I'll show you what the questions are in a minute. But what I'm going to do in this talk is to try and give you an overview of some of the analysis that's been done by economists, but set that in a rather wider context of immigration policy. Okay, so I mean, these are some of the, what I think are some of the important questions that we might want to ask about immigration policy. How many immigrants do we want to have in our individual country or in the EU as a whole? What sort of people do we want to invite to be immigrants to our countries? On what basis do we choose those immigrants? I mean, what is the argument for a certain type of immigrant as compared with another type of immigrant? That's something that economists, I think, have got something to say about. But we also have to engage with the immigration systems that we have got, and we want to ask, well, how do immigrants come into our country? Well, what are the mechanisms, what are the channels through, or the streams, if you like, through which they come? And then what follows from that is, well, what levers do we have? What policies can we introduce or use in order to adjust immigration to the level that we consider to be desirable? So how does immigration policy work? And then finally, and this is the sort of bottom line, if you like, from much of this, should we run immigration policies in Europe as individual country policies? Should we have a separate policy for Italy and a separate policy for Germany, another one for the UK? Or should we move towards a genuinely integrated policy across Europe? So I think that's a big question for the EU as a whole, and I will come to that at the end. Okay, so to start with, I want to just show you, oops, that was wrong button. I want to show you something about what economists say, how they think about immigration. So this is the sort of textbook model, if you like, of immigration. You'll see this in introductory text in economics. And let me explain what this diagram does. I have to say this is the only diagram I'm going to put in this, so if you are slightly bemused by this, don't worry, this is the only one you'll see. So along here we have the labor force, or we can think about this as employment, if you like, along the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis we've got the wage, and we're just going to think about the average wage here. And then along here, this downward sloping line here, which I've labeled D1, if you can see that, this is the demand for labor, the national demand for labor. So it's downward sloping, which means that employers are willing to employ more workers if they have a lower wage. And that's the standard sort of treatment in economics. These two vertical lines, this first one is the supply of labor. And this is the supply of labor before we have any immigrants. And so we can think of a pre-migration equilibrium, if you want to call it that, as a situation where the supply of labor is here, the demand for labor comes down like this, and the wage is determined by the intersection of those 2 points at W1. Okay, so that's all, so far so good. Now what happens when we have immigration? So the standard economic analysis says, well, one of the most important features of immigration, not the only feature, but one of the most important features is that it increases the supply of labor. So this vertical line here, S1, shifts to the right to become S2. Now you can see what implication that's going to have, provided that we're employing all or most of these additional workers. That is, we move from an equilibrium point here, A, to an equilibrium point down here, B. Now that has some implications. More people are employed, obviously, because we've moved the labor force out to here. But you'll see that the wage has fallen from W1 to W2. So that's one of the important factors. Let me just point to this as well. This is the wage that immigrants would have had in their home country before they became immigrants. So W2 is still way above the wage that, that immigrants would have got. So they're moving from a low-wage country to a high-wage country. Now, economists analyze this picture in terms of the total welfare for the economy. And there's what is called the immigration surplus. And that immigration surplus is this triangle here, Y. So there is a gain from immigration for society as a whole. But more important than that, there's distributional effects. What you can see is that the wage went down from W1 to W2, so workers who were originally employed lose an amount X, this box here. On the other hand, employers who benefit from this, because they're getting more workers at a lower wage, gain area X plus Y. So that's why there's an overall surplus, because the loss to workers is outweighed by the gain to employers. But you can see there are distributional effects. Some people are worse off, some people are better off. The final thing to point to is area Z. This is the gain to the migrants themselves. Now, this is a very simple diagram. It's just stylistic, but it really tells you, I think, what the debates are about in terms of immigration policy. You can make this much more complicated, but the fundamental issues are the same. There are distribution effects, and there's an overall gain. So what do we know about all this? Well, let's see. The immigration surplus is pretty small. As most people estimate it, maybe 0.1% of GDP. That's a very small number. The distributional effects are much bigger. It's not surprising. Some people's wages are going down, some people's profits are going up, and that has a much larger effect than the small triangle I showed you. However, this is somewhat contentious because economists have spent many years trying to estimate the fall in wages for non-immigrants as a result of immigrants coming in. And the range of estimates is something like this. If we had a 10% increase in the labor force as a result of immigration, the estimates are in the range of 0, no effect at all, to maybe a fall in the wage of 3%. That's not a huge number, but it's still significant. As I've said before, the biggest gainers are the immigrants. Some recent studies have illustrated, this is for the US, that migrants from countries, all countries to the US, gain by a factor of about 4 over what they would have got if they'd stayed in their home country. Those from the poorest countries, the gain is a factor of about 8. So the biggest beneficiaries of immigration are the migrants themselves. Some other work suggests that if we had a modest, I won't say what modest is, a modest loosening of immigration policy over the developed world, then the gains in terms of those sorts of areas I showed you could be as much as 156 billion. This is in about 2001. And just to stress, again, most of the gain that accrues in host countries is to the immigrants themselves. Okay. Now, think about the sort of political economy of this. Lots and lots of people in Italy, in Britain, in most countries are wage recipients. Most of us work for a wage. A few people, relatively few, are rentiers receive profits, rents, and so on. But they're the minority. So let's now think. Those who receive profits and rents are going to gain. Those who receive wages, on this analysis at least, are going to lose. So if we all have one vote, then the policy is going to be determined by who's more or less in the middle, and that's going to be the median voter, and the median voter is not going to want any immigration. So what this standard analysis suggests is that we won't have much immigration. Notice also that the people who gain most from immigration, the migrants themselves, don't have a vote, at least not before they come. So if we're setting an immigration policy now, we're doing so on the basis of people who are already here, and we're not doing so on the basis of the benefit that the people who would come if we had a generous or open immigration policy, we don't count their votes at this point. So that's a bit puzzling. And we say, well, why do we see immigration at all when, if this sort of political economy story has any traction to it whatsoever? Well, one argument, which has been made prominently by some Italian economists, among others, is that actually employers carry more weight in terms of their influence over immigration policy. And we've seen this in a number of contexts, for example, in the United States, where it's been most explored. You can think of the employers, for example, who are keen to employ Mexican migrants in the southwestern states of the US. They have a lot of political muscle in Washington. So it's that kind of story. But let me finally add a caveat to all this, and that is that we saw that the estimates of the wage effects are actually sometimes not very large at all. If that's true, then workers don't really lose very much, and employers still gain quite a bit. And so that might be another reason why we have immigration policies that admit fair numbers of immigrants, despite the fact that the standard approach would suggest we would be very tough on immigrants. Now, let's suppose that we do have that situation. We still need to resolve another question, that is, what if there are different types of workers? Suppose there are skilled workers and unskilled workers. That's the standard way of dividing people up. What difference does that make? Well, you could have a diagram very much like the one I've shown you before, in which instead of thinking about workers and employers, instead we think of skilled workers and unskilled workers, and we leave employers out of the picture a little bit. So let's now think, okay, we've got two sorts of workers, or two sorts of people, the skilled and the unskilled in our economy, and it's not surprising that if we apply the same sort of analysis that you've seen already, that if immigrants are skilled, then skilled non-immigrants are going to lose, and unskilled non-immigrants are going to gain. On the other hand, if the immigrants are unskilled, then it's clear that they will be competing directly with unskilled non-immigrants. Those are the people who are going to lose. The skilled immigrants who are now, the skilled non-immigrants or natives who now have more unskilled workers to work with them are going to gain. That's one thing. But here's another thing which has been put forward more recently, and that is what we worry about, among other things, is what the effects of immigration are, not just on our economy and on wages and profits, but rather also on the budget, the national budget. This is something which, is a particular concern to many of us right now when we've seen big budget deficits and cuts in public services and so on. And it turns out that when we look at opinion polls, for example, people are quite worried about the effects of immigration on taxes and benefits. And there are two stories you can tell about this. One is, suppose that when immigrants come in, taxes adjust, benefits stay the same. Now, skilled immigrants typically are high income, they're less often unemployed, and so if the taxes adjust, then skilled workers will favor skilled immigration because it helps to ease the tax burden. They will have to pay less tax to support a given amount of welfare state and other social expenditures and so on. On the other hand, if when immigrants come in, the effect is to lower the amount of benefits that go round to people because the benefit pot is fixed and therefore it's shared among a larger number of people, each person gets less as a result, then unskilled workers are going to be very concerned about unskilled immigration because it dilutes the benefits which they might get when they're unemployed or other social benefits. So that's another concern that's been raised by economists recently, and actually one of the most prominent of those arguing this case is Tito Boeri, who's the scientific director of this conference. A third thing I think which is widely believed and understood, not very well understood by economists, I might say, is prejudice. I mean, we've seen in Europe considerable opposition to immigration, which doesn't really arise from these sorts of issues, but which is based on prejudice on the idea that immigrants are different from us. We don't really want them living next door to us, marrying our daughters, becoming our boss, and so on. And that's not to be ignored, I think. It's an important issue. So let me just sort of show you what these sorts of, that sort of thinking adds up to. I've tried to tabulate in this table the arguments I've just given you. And so it depends on, we've got 4 columns here. We can think of what people's attitudes would be if immigrants are skilled. What would the attitude be of skilled workers and of unskilled workers to skilled immigrants coming in? On these 2 columns, we can see, supposing immigrants are unskilled, what will the reaction be of skilled workers, skilled people, and unskilled people as a result of these 4 things I've described earlier: the wage effect, whether taxes adjust, whether benefits adjust, and prejudice. And I don't want to go through all the cases because I've already described it, but if you just look at these panels, what you can see is that over here we've got a lot of negatives. A lot of minuses over here as compared with over here. There's only 1 over here, actually. That suggests that on the basis of these sorts of arguments, our policy would be one that would encourage skilled migration, highly educated and qualified people, and would discourage unskilled migration. So I've got 2 questions that follow from that. What do people's attitudes look like towards migrants and migration? We want to quickly look at that. And secondly, what does the skill mix of immigration look like when we look at the data? And I'm only going to be skipping sort of rather briefly through this, but let me give you a flavor of some of the data that economists have often looked at. Now, this is an opinion survey that was taken in 2003. I'm sorry, it's a bit dated now, but the advantage of it is that it covers a wide range of countries. This is the International Social Survey Program survey, and they only do questions on immigration once in a while, and so this is the most recent one we've got. And what they do is ask people questions about their attitudes towards immigration, and then they ask them to score on a 1 to 5 scale what their particular attitude is. Now, in these columns here, the 5 is bad for society or bad for the economy or take jobs away. 1 would be very good for society, very good for the economy, and so on. Okay, so that's the way it's scaled. Now, a fairly neutral attitude, remember it's 1 to 5, a neutral attitude would be about 3, right, somewhere in the middle. And when you look at these columns here, you see that actually we're not as opposed to immigration as many people would like to think. And most people are neutral or a little bit positive on average towards immigration. Now, of course, there's a wide range of attitudes within that, all the way from 1 all the way up to 5. But on average, it seems that most people are fairly neutral towards it. Similarly, is immigration bad for the economy? Well, some people think it is. Some people don't think that. And on average, it's around 3 in these countries. Differs a bit between countries, as you can see. Do immigrants take our jobs away and leave us unemployed? That's one of the biggest arguments that we hear in the popular debate about immigration. Here's what people think, which is that, well, a balance, more or less in the middle. Some people yes, some people no, a lot of people in the middle. What about the attitude towards immigration policy? This is getting a bit closer to, what we want to see happen in terms of immigration policy. Should we reduce immigration by a lot, by a little, keep it about the same, increase it by a little, increase it by a lot? That's the scale, 1 to 5. Rather, 5 is reduce immigration by a lot. You can see that we're a little bit more negative here. We are somewhat more negative here. And so there are things other than these that are coming into it. Prejudice would be one, but it's not the only one. So we're on balance somewhat against immigration, but not as strongly against it as you might expect if you read some of the reports in the press. You might point to this, which is my own country, which is one of the most anti-immigration countries in Europe, and I'm somewhat embarrassed by that. Okay. So I've said a bit about that. Let's have a look now at what our immigrants are actually like. Now, of course, you could measure immigrants and classify them in a variety of different ways. Lots of ways of looking at people and classifying them one way or another. And the way economists have typically looked at this, and largely it's a result of the sorts of surveys and data that we have available, is to look at people by their level of education, the highest level of education that they've got. And we've got a number of surveys that show that, and this is just one of them, and the reason I picked this is because you will have seen, by the way, in the attitudes I showed you before, Italy wasn't there, and the reason is that it's not in that particular survey. So I picked this one to make sure Italy was in there. And here's the proportion of non-immigrants, this is age 25 and over, and the proportion of immigrants who have at least tertiary education. And you can see it varies quite a bit across countries. Some of this is differences in precise definitions, but the broad picture is, I think, fairly clear. And the broad picture is that among our immigrants, about the same share of immigrants have tertiary education as of non-immigrants. So broadly speaking, immigration is not altering the share of people with high education. So it's not really the case, as sometimes we think, that we're either recruiting all these wonderful nuclear physicists who are actually not going to be needed after our referendum next week. And neither is it the case that we're just, having very low education migrants. When you look down this end of the table, which is those with less than upper secondary education, I wish we could show those with very low education, that is less than completed primary education, but it's not in this particular data set. You can see that in some countries at least, we find that low-skilled immigrants are a bit more prevalent among immigrants than they are among non-immigrants. So there's some cases here, and again, let me say, if we were to look at those people with very low education, or in fact no education, we would find a much higher proportion of that among immigrants than among the native born. So there is some evidence that, and you can see it's not all that different from countries outside the EU, you can see there's some evidence that we do recruit quite a lot of low-skilled immigrants. And that may be something we don't want to do so much of for the reasons that I've already mentioned. Let me switch now to what the policy channels are. What are the ways through which immigrants come into the country? And the reason I'm doing this is because I had a conversation yesterday with Emma Bonino, who thinks that most people are not really aware of how the migration system works, and therefore are less clear in their distinction between these different types of groups. And so I think this is, if she's right, which I think perhaps she is, then it's worth doing. Okay, so let me just switch to the next slide then. And this is some data which I pulled out for 2007. One reason for that is that it's a normal year. It's before the Great Recession, so I don't want to upset things with that. These are just published data and from the OECD, and I've just taken a selection of countries here somewhat similar to the ones you've seen before. And what this is telling us is of the migrants who came into these countries in 2007, what channels did they come through? And I grouped them here into 4 main channels. One is employment. These are people who enter the country on the grounds that they are getting a visa for employment. So they're people for whom they're coming through the employment stream. Secondly, this column is people who enter through family reunification. In other words, the reason they're coming in is because, or the way they're coming in is because they're getting entry through being married or having relations with somebody who's already in the country, right? So they may be children, they may be parents, they may be other relatives, but they're often spouses. That's the main thing. Thirdly, we have humanitarian migration. This is refugees, asylum seekers who apply for asylum in the various countries. And finally, here, this is free migration. And this is migrants from one EU country to another EU country. Right? They're not subject to immigration policy, and they're free to move around wherever they want to. And you can see that's a very large number relative to the number that we admit on other grounds. What I want you to take away from this is that employment's relatively small, right? Employment's it's significant for some countries, but on average, it's a relatively small part of immigration. And economists worry all the time about skills and the labor market and employment and so on. But I can tell you now, this is only the tip of the iceberg. It's not the whole iceberg. This is only one part of immigration, and not a particularly big part. And if we're worrying about how we're going to select more skilled migrants for employment, which I think is a good thing, but if we're worrying about that, it's only going to apply to this relatively small proportion. And so you're not going to revolutionize the pattern of immigration by simply tightening up a little bit on the skill requirements that are needed for someone to come in for an employment visa. And in fact, for most countries, those people who come on employment visas as permanent migrants, not as temporary migrants, as permanent migrants, are relatively skilled anyway. So we're not going to get much leverage out of more skill selection applied to the employment stream. Family reunification is a very big one, as you can see here, and humanitarian immigration, refugees and asylum seekers, which has actually gone down by quite a lot in the last decade, are significant, but now, in 2007 at least, not as large as they were. Let me talk first all about asylum. Let me step back a bit. One point I wanted to make before leaving this is, you may say, well, this is the bit that we've got some control over as far as immigration policy is concerned. These two components, we don't really have much control over. After all, family reunification is determined by, whether people have got relatives. We can't simply block out everybody's relatives. That would be against, human rights conventions and all sorts of other EU legislation. That's very difficult to do. We can't really, be tough on refugees because we're signatories to the Refugee Convention. We have to observe that. So you might say, well, actually, immigration policy is quite severely constrained when you look at where we can actually take action. That's not quite as true as it seems, and I'll explain why. Something I've studied in some depth is asylum. And across the OECD, there was a big fall in asylum applications between 2001 and 2006. Most of these people, not most, many of these asylum seekers arrive illegally, and they are perfectly able to apply for asylum, even though they've gained entry illegally. That's not a disqualification. Only about 25% gain some form of recognition or status from this procedure. Many of the others often stay illegally. Not all, but quite a few. These migrants often have rather poor outcomes as far as the labour market is concerned, but also as far as things like housing, health, all sorts of other dimensions of social integration asylum seekers actually do rather badly at. And one key element is, how do they gain employment? How do they do in gaining employment? And the answer is not very well. Several studies, this is just one, but several studies have shown that refugees and asylum seekers have a real tough time in getting jobs. And then they more often rely on social security, social welfare. What's happened over the years is that our attitudes towards refugees, which in most people in European countries are very positive about providing sanctuary for people escaping war and persecution. Not surprisingly, most people are very positive about that. But the attitudes have soured a bit over the last 15, 20 years. The reason is that people are coming in illegally because there's no other way for them to get in, and that illegality has undermined support for the asylum system. So asylum has become conflated with illegal immigration in a way that's made it very difficult to pull these two things apart. So people's attitudes towards asylum have become much more negative, largely because they're conflated with illegality. But can we do anything about this? Is it possible to do anything? Well, I think the answer is it is. I've done some work in the last few years to try and analyze what difference policy makes to the number of people who apply for asylum. In other words, are tougher asylum policies a deterrent to people coming and applying for asylum? Many people say no. Human rights activists often say, well, all we're doing is making the asylum seekers suffer even more than they would otherwise. We're not deterring them because these are people fleeing persecution. They're not going to be influenced by our policy. Well, I don't think that's true. Here's a bit of evidence. Here's my policy index here. Tougher policy as we move from left to right. Change in asylum applications as we go up here. And you can see here that generally speaking, this is across various different countries of the OECD, all of the EU, plus US, Canada, Australia, so on. That's what these dots are. So you can see there's a general negative correlation between these two things. Tougher policy, fewer applications on average. And a more sophisticated analysis of this, looking at individual countries over time, what happens when policy changes, entirely supports that picture. Family reunification. Can we do anything about that or not? It's something which economists have almost completely forgotten about, I have to say. They haven't really looked seriously at family migrants. And it's a potentially important part of migration, as I've shown you. One reason is that, we can see how many people come as family reunification migrants based on one initial principal immigrant, right? This work has been mainly done for the US. Here's some evidence here about the family reunification multiplier. If you admit one principal immigrant, how many other people are you then essentially going to admit? And that's what the answer is up here. One thing that comes out of this is that the multiplier is larger for poorer countries. If you take a principal immigrant from, the Congo, you'll get more relatives than you will if you take a principal immigrant from, New Zealand or some other rich country. It's quite clear. Interestingly, just as an aside, when the United States, this is an interesting experiment, a policy experiment, the United States in 1965 moved away from a policy favoring essentially Europeans only to one that was anti-discriminatory across the world. And some people argue that we don't want to change the nature of American society. We want it to be basically a European, a sort of Anglo-Saxon-led European type of society, not one which is like the Congo or Nigeria or Indonesia or China. So what we'll do is we will make our immigration policy one which has family reunification as its center stage. Most of the migrants we'll admit will be family reunification people. And since the people we've already got here are all Europeans, that should mean that we'll just get more and more Europeans. They were wrong, completely wrong. And the reason is that the multiplier is much, much bigger for people in other countries, from other countries. Can we do anything about it? Well, a number of countries have reformed their conditions for family reunification. Among them, France and the Netherlands, which have become much tougher on the conditions, both for the principal applicant, that is, the person that you're going to reunify with, has to be have a job, have a certain level of income, not be dependent on Social Security. The migrant increasingly has to be familiar with the country, have relevant language skills, and a whole list of other things. This graph shows that this is a policy index for family reunification, where at this time, as we move from left to right, policy gets more generous. So it's different from what I showed you for asylum seekers. And here's the share of family migrants as a proportion of the foreign stock of migrants. You see it's, roughly speaking, upward sloping. So there is some scope to manage migration through these other streams and not just through the employment stream. I want to mention one other thing which is a particular hobby horse of mine because I think it's important, and that is students. Many European countries, like the US, Canada and Australia as well, but many European countries recruit overseas students. They're not counted in the numbers you saw before because they're not permanent migrants. They're temporary migrants. They only get temporary visas for the period of their study. Many of them don't return, or many of them actually would like not to return. And a number of European countries, I include Britain in that, were not willing to let them stay until recently. And that seems a bit odd because these are young people. We need young people. They've got qualifications that are relevant to the host society because they've been studying there for 3 years. They've taken an advanced degree, so they're well qualified. They meet other people from the country. They get network. They make friends. They've got contacts. These are people who are perfect for the labor market in the country they've gone to. Now, not all of them want to stay, but some do. What's more, they pay. It's a wonderful system. They pay to come. And not only that, they cross-subsidize the education of many non-immigrants because they pay quite high fees, many of them. And furthermore, they keep me employed. Here's an illustration of the sort of magnitudes that are involved. Again, this is for 2007. It varies a lot between countries, but I want you to look at just the last column here, because what I've done here is to take the ratio of the student inflow divided by the total permanent migration for that year. Okay, so it's just to scale the students relative to other migrants. And you can see that for quite a few European countries, this is a reasonably large number. I mean, it's pretty big for France and Germany. It's huge for the UK. It's even fairly large for Sweden and Switzerland. Rather low, I'm afraid, for Italy and Spain. This is a wonderfully good policy if we want to select strongly motivated, highly qualified, as well assimilated migrants from abroad. So that's just my sermon on that. Let me now end by discussing very briefly the policies that we've got and how it's been developing in recent years. We've seen a number of initiatives to try and select more skilled migrants. And we've had green cards issued, for example, in Germany. In the UK, we've loosened up on allowing students to stay. We have now gone backwards on that, I'm very sorry to say. In asylum, we've had an enormous crackdown, as you saw, in policy, which has largely satisfied public opinion, but has left us in a bit of a mess as far as the international refugee regime is concerned. And we've seen that some countries have toughened quite severely on family reunification. And I think one background to this actually has been the EU expansion, because what some countries like particularly continental European countries have done is they worry a bit about people from places like Romania, Bulgaria, and they think, well, if we're going to get a lot of unskilled workers from those countries, maybe we should become even tougher on where we do have control, which is on immigration from outside the EU. So I think that's been part of the story in recent years. What about the EU as a whole? Well, we've had some harmonization. The Schengen Treaty is important, Schengen Agreement's important, and since 1999, there's been a very gradual process of harmonization of policy, focused largely on asylum, but also directives on things like family reunification, long-term residence. So the scope for individual countries to adjust their policies independently has gradually been narrowing. It's not all that narrow at the moment, but it's gradually narrowing. The Hague process built on that between 2005, 2010, and now we're in a third phase, which is the Stockholm process. And the purpose of all this has been to harmonize policies. But after all, it's still not gone very far. Policy is still largely under national control. Okay, so should we have a EU-wide policy then? What would be the gains from having a policy at the EU level rather than letting individual countries decide? I mean, you might think that individual countries know what's best for them, and therefore they should be free to have whatever policy suits them and their electors will vote for. So now the main reason for thinking that an EU-wide policy is worth having is what economists call externalities. This is something which, when I do something, it affects you, not through some market mechanism, but just affects you directly. We can make this argument very clearly in terms of asylum, refugee, and humanitarian policies. Let me tell you the reason for that. It is that if we all think that it's good to rescue people who are suffering from persecution in far-off countries and give them a safe haven in our country, then I also feel good if Germany does that, because I know those refugees are being looked after. I feel good if Italy does that. I also feel good if my own country does it, right? Now, if looking after refugees is something which we think is a benefit to the EU as a whole, individual country policies don't take into account the benefit of those policies to other countries, right? That's the sort of market failure, if you want to call it that. I've been sort of pressing this line for some years, and I have a little book coming out just in a couple of weeks' time with the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London, which again makes this argument, forgive me for the advertising. But I just said that what we've been doing is harmonizing, getting policies the same across countries. And different countries, as you saw from the tables earlier, face very different numbers of people applying for asylum because of their proximity to, for example, Libya or something like that currently, or previously to Kosovo. They're facing very different demands. If we have a uniform policy on admitting asylum seekers, we shall end up with very uneven refugee burdens across our different countries. And that's not what we want. What we want is a spread around the countries. So what this implies is that we do need some form of burden sharing. This has been debated since the mid-90s, and very little has been done about it. We do have a directive of 2001, which calls for burden sharing as a voluntary balance of efforts between EU countries. It doesn't work. I mean, people won't sign up to it. Well, they've signed up to it, but people won't volunteer to do it. We need some mechanism at the higher level to make it happen. So that's the story I want to argue about asylum and refugees. What about other forms of migration? Is there a case there for European integration? Well, some people argue that there are negative spillovers that take place. When you tighten the border in one place, people move to another place to try and get across the border. We've seen that very clearly demonstrated in the border controls between the US and Mexico. So that's one possible reason, and some people have argued that. But overall, the argument, I think, is less strong for immigration policy than it is for asylum and refugee policies. And the externalities are less obvious, that's one reason. And secondly, we are actually moving independently in the same direction, so perhaps it's not such a big issue. One argument might be, well, what we want to do is to give weight to poverty reduction, right? I showed earlier on how massive the gains are for migrants coming from very poor countries to rich countries like Britain, Italy, France, Germany, or the US. If we put weight on that, we want to make these people better off, then okay, we can bring back in these sorts of arguments that say, let's do that, but if Germany does that or Italy does that, I should feel good about it even though I'm living in Britain. So that would be the argument there. I think it's a weaker argument, frankly, than it is for asylum. Now, there are two other arguments I want to stress here, which I think actually, if anything, are more important. One, which has come to the forefront recently, is if we admit migrants to one country and they skip across the border to another country and they cause that country problems or consternation or difficulties, I'm not saying that's what happened, I don't think it did really, then each country's immigration policy affects the other country rather directly. So if we want to protect the Schengen Agreement and keep borders within Europe open, one way of doing that, or one step towards doing that, is to try and unify our external policy towards immigration across Europe a bit more than we've done so far. But in my view, actually the strongest argument of all is politics. If you look across European countries, and there's been an outbreak of this recently in Northern Europe, you see that immigration policy, and particularly refugee policy, seems to be determined very largely by extreme right-wing parties. They seem, even though the parties are often very small, what they do is they raise the salience of immigration and refugee issues in the public mind through the newspapers and so on. And as a result of that, it's not that they get into government, they don't always get into government, but they do shift the agendas of the mainstream parties. And insofar as these are based on xenophobia, on prejudice, on other fears that actually don't have much basis of fact, then we don't really want that to drive our policy. If we can take some of the more, some of the hotter issues out of domestic politics and decide this and determine this at the EU level, then I think we'd have a more liberal and I think a more a policy that would better serve the people of the EU. Now you might say, well, nobody's going to want this, right? We just don't want this. We want our own policy. Is that what public opinion says? Actually, it's not that clear. If you look at the European Social Survey for 2002-03, it's going back a bit, but it was a time when there were huge numbers of refugees and asylum seekers coming in, and you ask people, would you like immigration and asylum policies to be set at the international level, at the European level, at the national level, or, as in Swiss cantons, at the local level? And a majority of people in Europe said, 57% said they would rather see immigration and asylum policy set either at the international level or at the European level, right? So I think actually, despite the fact that you may feel that this is not going to be a popular policy, I think there would be enough popular support for it to make it happen. And that's it. Thank you.
Grazie, Professor Hatton.
Many thanks, Professor Hatton. Now, let's see if there are questions or comments from the audience. There is a person there asking for the microphone. Please identify yourself. My name is Sergio Briguglio, and I deal with immigration policy. I've been doing that for 20 years in Italy now. I found Professor Hatton's... Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Testing, testing. Can you hear me, Professor Hatton? Can you hear me?
Forse è cambiato il canale della traduzione.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. I found your presentation very interesting. I'd like to illustrate some comments, and then I'd like to have your opinion. Well, I'll speak about the Italian situation because I know the regulations in Italy and I know the situation in Italy. Well, of course, an international or a European policy on immigration can have certain advantages. For example, when you define minimum standards in terms of rights of immigrants, in terms of family reunification or free circulation for employment reasons in the case of permanent immigrants. But with reference to selection mechanisms, well, each country would like to do on its own. So each country wants to decide alone. Well, this depends on the fact that the immigration that each country needs today is different. It varies from country to country. For example, in Italy, we have a lot of low qualified immigrants. Perhaps they are educated people, but they are employed in welfare services, home services. And that's because in Italy, these services are missing. And so perhaps this is not the case for Germany. Well, I think that a possible solution could be not so much to have common rules and common standards for selecting immigrants, because in that case, nobody would be happy about that. But a possible solution would be to have the possibility of a special selection and the possibility of mechanisms for attracting qualified people, so that it is possible to keep that type of immigration which perhaps came to the country for a low qualified job, but then it's a type of immigration which shows capacities and skills. An example, we could favor for example, a permanent stay for these people, for example. So what's your opinion, Professor Hatton, on all these comments?
These are very important and interesting questions. I think what I would say is that it's not all that clear to me that there is such a big difference between European countries on this. I mean, for example, we've agreed to have a European blue card, a way to try and encourage highly skilled migrants to come into Europe, and that's EU-wide policy, which we've managed to agree on. As far as the low-skilled migrants are concerned, I mean, I'm not sort of as against low-skilled migration as it might seem, but what I would argue, I think, is that we can recruit low-skilled migrants through other channels than the employment stream. And what I would say about low-skilled migrants is that we do have other methods, which I haven't actually mentioned here, which I think are important, and that is temporary migration. I think temporary migration actually is a very good way of, filling those sort of holes in the economy, seasonal differences in employment, for example, in agriculture and other sorts of areas like that. I think we can plug a lot of these gaps in low-skilled labor market with temporary migration. And I mean, if you look at the unemployment numbers, not just now, but even 3 or 4 years ago, what you can see is that there are a lot of unskilled unemployed. And there doesn't seem to be a great shortage in most European countries of unskilled workers who would be willing to work at what we might regard as a reasonable minimum wage. So I'm not entirely convinced about the shortage of unskilled workers. I think insofar as there is specific need in certain sectors, we can plug that with temporary migrants.
Grazie.
Other questions? Well, I'd like to make a question as a curious journalist, and I'd like to have your comment. Well, in the current debate, many criticize Lady Ashton, the Foreign Minister of the European Union, while others say that the minister is not guilty, that Mrs. Ashton is not guilty. It's not to be blamed. It's a question of policies. And there are some who blame single countries
because of different policies. So what's your idea of the current situation on the immigration policy, and are there solutions?
Well, specifically on immigration policies, I mean, I think I've laid out the route that we've taken in the EU, which is a step-by-step process of harmonization. And I welcome that. I think that's a good idea. I wish some countries that have opted out, I'm not going to name them, but the countries that have opted out would opt in. There are 3 of them. And you know, I think we're on the way to a more integrated policy. I won't say we are on the way to a completely integrated policy. Where we can make most progress, in my view, is in asylum and refugees. I think we could also do something on family reunification, because I see no reason why we shouldn't have relatively uniform rules about that for the EU. But I do think that, I mean, we have a number of the building blocks in place now to do this. For example, in asylum, going back to asylum once again, we have the European Refugee Fund, we have the European Asylum Support Office. I mean, there's a whole structure there now which can be used, but which doesn't have executive power. That's the trouble with it, really. And we're a lot further back with policy towards immigrants generally, the skills stream, family reunification, these other areas. I see no reason why we can't integrate on stream by stream. That I think we could do. I mean, the idea of sort of erecting a massive, you know, immigration policy from nowhere is just not consistent with the way the EU works, is it? It's step by step, 2-3 steps forward, maybe 1 step back. We just keep going. We gradually integrate. And that's what's happened over the last 50 years in the EU, and that's what's happening here as well, I think. And I think as Esther Duflo said yesterday, the thing is to understand the problem first and then approach it step by step.
Yeah, a policy of small steps. This is something that is very well known also in Italy. There is a comment here, or a question. So there's another down there.
Yes, sir. I'm a Chinese student who studies in the University of Toronto, and I feel grateful to have the opportunity to study in Italy, and the people are very nice to give us resources and helpful information to improve my education skills. Yeah. But I found that there's a tension between the immigration community and the local community. And most of my Italian friends find it difficult to make friends with immigrants, especially from people from East Asia. They have different cultural background, different values. And for Chinese people or Asian people find it difficult to get integrated to the local community. So I wonder if there is a way to change the public opinion to have a safer public involvement to solve the problem of the integration of and provide more services towards immigrants to eliminate the threat in the public sphere. And especially I had some limited unhappy experience once when I entered the conference hall and an Italian guy pointed his finger to me that you should go away, go back to China. And I felt very upset, but after that, I found that there must be a way to solve this problem, to change the public opinion, to let the local community feel safe, feel comfortable to accept as immigrants or temporary immigrants, especially for us, the students took 20 hours flights to come here and have homesick and very difficult situation. Thank you.
Grazie per la sua testimonianza e naturalmente a titolo personale ma anche
So thank you so much for your personal experience. Well, of course, I express my sympathy for what happened to you. And I certainly blame those idiots who told those words to you. Professor Hatton, your comment.
Thank you very much for the question. Congratulations on coming to study in Italy, and I really do hope your studies turn out successfully and you enjoy the rest of your time here, because I think it's people like you that we want to attract. Let me say something about how this happens. I mean, I said earlier that the attitudes towards immigrants vary a bit across countries, and what you see actually is that it's not been all that much change over time in the last, say, 15 years. Where we have seen changes in attitudes has been in countries who've received immigrants, a large surge of immigrants where they previously had very few. And the countries I have in mind, for example, are Spain and Ireland, right? And what that says to me is that when immigrants who are unfamiliar faces from unfamiliar places suddenly arrive, especially if they arrive in large numbers, that's a bit of a shock, and it's hard to, it takes time for host communities to get used to immigrants, to accept and value what they bring, and to appreciate the sort of cultural diversity that they bring along with them. If you look at countries that have long accepted lots and lots of immigrants, places like the United States, Australia, which I spend half of my time in, they are much better at it than we are in Europe, I think. And there's a good reason for that. They've been doing it for much longer than we have. And so we do get better at it. Okay, the second point is that, and I think the message from that is, let's not have a massive, we want to do it bit by bit, step by step. That's the best way to do it, I think, because we will integrate people much better if we do it like that. I think we have to admit, prejudice is there. There's no question about that, and it's silly not to try and ignore it. Education is one of the main ways of reducing it, because if you look at all the surveys and the data, you can see attitudes that are prejudiced are much less often found among educated people. It's one of the most it's the clearest thing you can see in the data. So education is important. A third thing that's important is anti-discrimination law. We've got that in Europe. We've developed it more and more, and we have also been, again, step by step, introducing methods or measures to better integrate migrants. Not people like you, I have to say, because you're at university, but people who come in as asylum seekers, refugees, and other migrants. We had a series of initiatives to better integrate people like that with programs on language and employment and so on. But that's not really going to do the trick, because what we need is to change our own attitudes, the host country attitudes, and that will happen gradually. And you can see the effects of that.
Mi piace sottolineare il suo ottimismo.
Well, thank you for your optimism, Professor Hatton. I share your optimism.
Prego.
Grazie. I'm going to ask the question in English. I'm Giovanni Peri, but I teach in California. And the gentleman who just spoke, if you don't feel too well in University of Trento, apply to University of California. Half of our body of students is Chinese. We'll welcome you. My question is on the step-by-step, and I understand very well, and I agree with Tim about the need to coordinate the policy on refugee, on asylum seekers, and I think there are a lot of benefits in doing this. Probably in this specific field, the externality is very clear. The question will be, as in many other type of policies in Europe, my question is, would a coordination across country work, or would we need an EU authority, maybe invested by the single country at some point, but with an executive power itself, to run this. This has worked for many policies, right? Monetary policy, for a while we coordinated. At some point we needed a European central bank if we wanted the whole thing to work. So the question is, as long as are the Italians, the Greek, to enforce some common authority, there will always be, unless the rules are super clear, maybe even automatic, there will always be this idea of there is an asymmetric burden. Are you envisioning this sort of a creation of an EU-wide authority, or what would be your way of thinking of going that way? Thanks.
I agree with you entirely. I mean, I think that we do need an EU authority. I mean, coordination between countries sometimes works, and sometimes it doesn't work too well. But I think the only way, particularly for asylum and refugees, we do need an EU authority. And as I was saying earlier on, and we do have the building blocks to create that. I mean, we've got a number of steps to go, but we already have the European Asylum Support Office, we have a European Refugee Fund, so we do have, you know, some common elements already that could be built upon to build a EU-wide authority. Now, the way I would see this working, and this is important because, you know, you don't want to superimpose a completely new administration on top of what we've already got at country level. The way I would propose it is that the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, should be greatly strengthened, and what we should have is an EASO office in every country, or an EASO representative, right? So somebody who's embedded in the institutional structure of that country, so that you can then impose an EU-wide policy without creating a whole new administration, and deliver it through the existing institutions of that country. So that would be my plan. And actually, going back to this question about whether people would support it or not, I mean, support for an international or European level asylum and immigration policy is much higher than it is for a Europe-wide agricultural policy or a Europe-wide monetary policy, two things that we actually have.
Abbiamo spazio ancora per una o due domande.
Right, we have time for a couple more questions, if there are any.
I'm an economist. I just want to ask about, well, you were mentioning the fact that there are unemployed, unskilled workers in various European countries, and the immigration is a mix of skilled and unskilled. So how true is the argument that the unskilled natives are unemployed because the unskilled immigrants take away the jobs because they are willing to work for a lower wage? So is there any evidence that this is actually the case? And can I add on just another question about what you just said about people, highly educated people being less prejudiced against immigrants? Does it have to do with the fact that highly educated people are actually wealthier and richer, so that actually it's easier to find themselves in an easier position to be less prejudiced than perhaps poor people, because education is really correlated with a level of wealth? Thank you much.
Thanks very much for these questions. These are very good questions, and actually they strike right to the heart of a lot of the research that economists do on this. Let me come clean about the question of whether unskilled immigrants displace native-born unskilled workers. There is a huge controversy over this. Some people say they do, and they prove it with some data that they've got and empirical analysis they do. Other people find nothing. The prevalent result, I think, is small or nothing. So, you know, we don't have a lot of evidence, and there are differences between different studies. So it's not possible to be completely definitive about that. My guess is that the answer is the effects are probably small, but, you know, there is a diversity of opinion on that. Question of education. Is it income, or is it sort of liberal culture? Or, you know, and that's a good question. Some people have recently been studying precisely that issue. And you know, it's a bit difficult to tease that out of the sort of opinion poll data that I showed you a little bit of. But people started to do that. And for EU countries, basically the result is that it's a bit of both. It's about 1/3 income and social position, not being in competition with these people, with unskilled immigrants, and about 2/3 of it is cultural values. So it's a bit of, you're spot on in saying that there are these two things, and you know, that's the evidence. It's a bit of both, but cultural values are a bit more important than income.
Abbiamo spazio, direi, per l'ultima domanda.
One last question.
And on the point, doing a point system, so something like Canada has done, and a comment someone made earlier. Coming from California, we have a large agricultural sector, and it's been tried repeatedly in California, for example, to use the low-skilled or unskilled, unemployed person to go into the fields to pick strawberries and to put immigration around so that the other workers aren't there, or pick grapes. And one is that kind of labor is a little more skilled than you think. And the second one is perhaps the people who are unemployed, which in America is usually less benefit than in most countries in Europe that I know of. Nonetheless, the workers last hardly more than 1 hour or 2 hours. So there's sort of that difficulty, which I guess you're solving by the sort of temporary green card thing of coming in and out. To that point, then you have to think about the question of the temporary worker who marries someone, who develops the relationship and actually marries someone and has a child during the time that they are in Europe, let's say, as a temporary worker, and policies of family reunification. In Europe, you don't have the American thing on citizenship of if you're born in the country, you're automatically a citizen, which is entirely another question than what you talked about today. But anyway, that was just a little thing that came to mind with regard to that level of worker and what we have a lot of experience, particularly in the state from which I come.
Yeah, those are both very good questions, and I agree with the fact that we shouldn't just trivialize the skills that are involved in some of these occupations. I mean, they are definitely skills of one sort or another. They're manual skills rather than brain power, so to speak, but let's not undervalue that. Unskilled people who are unemployed are often difficult to move, and they don't necessarily want to move for a short season because, you know, there's other opportunities they may get. And it's a bit difficult to do that. That's why I do recommend temporary worker programs, because they have worked reasonably well. And actually there's some experiments going on in other parts of the world too, which have shown quite substantial benefits from temporary worker programs for the workers themselves. And there's an experiment going on, for example, of temporary workers going from Pacific Islands like Fiji and so on to New Zealand for a season to work in agriculture and viticulture, and that's been a tremendous success. It's helped both the New Zealand farmers, and it's helped the people back home. So I would argue that's a very welcome thing. As far as family reunification is concerned, I'm not arguing that we should abolish family reunification by any means. I'm just saying that it is possible to alter our policies on that. But if somebody has a legitimate claim to family reunification, given what our laws and rules are, then we should give it to them. I wouldn't want to argue against that. But you know, in the U.S., as you know, there's a very generous family reunification policy that extends not just to immediate family, but which are not even under the U.S. quota, but to more distant family members who are subject to an overall worldwide quota in the U.S. immigration code, but still are very large numbers of them, and actually they are in the majority of permanent legal migrants to the U.S.
Professore, prima di salutarla.
Professor Hatton, before letting you go, I have one last question, if you allow me, also because I was really stricken by reading the online news about the beginning of the recovery of the first corpses since a boat sank last Tuesday with more than 800 people on board just off the Tunisian coast. So maybe this morning we haven't addressed the role of the media, the role of communication means, the role of journalists in an attempt at trying to overcome the prejudice factor which you have so well described in your presentation. Well, I realize that this question could be the topic for another conference, but I have to ask you this question. So what can the media do as far as public opinion is concerned? What can information do? A proposal was made some months ago of a European radio which could be the seed for a European information public service. So we could start with immigration as an important unifying topic for this European radio television network. So which is your advice? Which is your recipe to promote via means of communication to overcome prejudice?
Question, that's an interesting one. I mean, my heart always sinks, as yours does, when boats sink and when people aren't rescued. And I think we need to do a bit better on that as far as Frontex is concerned, which is the European agency responsible for protecting a border and patrolling at the moment North Africa. There aren't many boats out there at the moment, but we need to do a bit better on that. Having said that, the vast majority of people who come as either asylum seekers or illegal immigrants to Europe don't come by boat. They are people who typically come in with a visa, tourist visa or some other visa, and overstay the visa. So, I mean, boat people are massive in the media. They're absolutely, minuscule in terms of total immigration. So you have a situation where the plight of a few people is being blown up to represent, immigration problems much more widely when it's really only a very small problem. That's not to say we shouldn't deal better with it. So, and that does happen through the media, and it's a good story for the media. I mean, it sells papers. My worry about, and in the short book I've just written, I do talk about this. I don't really have a solution to it because you say, well, okay, and we have a terrible media in Britain for this. I mean, we have very, what I think is very prejudiced media who really make hay on sort of sad stories like this. And, you want to have some sort of press code, but on the other hand, people buy these papers. I mean, you get the media that you deserve in some sense. If people are going to continue to buy these papers, then we're not going to solve the problem by providing another medium if that's not what people want. They want to read the papers that they're currently reading and which have these sorts of stories in them. So I don't think another newspaper or another radio station or another this or that is really going to solve the problem. It is a problem, I think. And but it's not one I have a solution to.
Crediamo nel pluralismo.
We believe in pluralism. We believe in the possibility that through multiple channels, the message will pass so that we all can have a shared awareness of these issues. So thank you very much, Professor Hatton. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you to the International Festival of Economics in Trento. Thank you to all of you, and enjoy your day.